All right, I guess we're live. Hopefully, the technical aspects of this are going to work themselves out. You can see me, hear me okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. 'Tis I, Matthew Kadish, author extraordinary and co-host of the Salty Nerd podcast, coming at you this morning/afternoon to talk about Star Trek. But first, I want to thank everyone who is watching us. David Walker, thanks for coming. Appreciate you checking out the stream. We're going to have a fun stream today. We're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is, of course, Star Trek. And we're going to be looking at it from a writing perspective, try to figure out, what we can do to improve upon what's come before. But first and foremost, I just want to introduce myself to people who may not be familiar with who I am. I am an author and a screenwriter and a filmmaker and a podcaster and all that good stuff. Part of the Salty Nerd podcast crew, and we're gearing up for the big Star Trek convention here in sunny and beautiful Las Vegas. Oh, thank you, David. You like the shirt? Yeah, this was a Mangold inspired shirt. So we've got these on the saltynerdstore.com storefront. So if you want to be a basement dweller like me, head on over there and pick up that shirt. So we got a lot of stuff to do today. We're continuing to experiment with our live streams. One of the cool things about today's live stream is that we're actually monetized, and we were able to get super chats turned on. So if you guys want to be throwing us some super chats today, feel free to do so. Otherwise, no big deal. I think we also are approved for super thanks, which is a new thing that YouTube is doing, where you can actually do a super chat as a comment, and it gets featured at the top of the comments section. So if you guys want to experiment with that, please feel free. All the money goes towards supporting the podcast. And what we mean by that is that our ultimate goal is to get Alex, the host of the show, and Matt Vader 74, the co-host of the show, to the point where they can quit their jobs and have the podcast replace their salary that they're doing right now, so that they can focus on doing the show full time. And I think it's a really noble goal, because these guys are absolutely fantastic people, just personally, because I know them. And they're also very passionate about the podcast and movies and creating content and stuff like that. So I think it's a worthy cause. So if you guys want to help support the channel and help us reach that goal where these guys can start doing the podcast full time, really appreciate it. And also throw us a thumbs up on the video. That helps us with the YouTube algorithm. So if you like our videos, just giving us a like helps get us out in front of more people. And hopefully once more people are exposed to our content, we can grow the channel. So we really appreciate everything you guys do, showing up to chat, participating, all that good stuff. And we actually got a super sticker from Raj H, $2 Canadian. Thank you so much, Raj. I think you are our very first super chatter, so hey, we hit a milestone. Thank you, Raj. We're going to I'm going to make a note of your name, and we're going to do a special tribute to you on the podcast for being our very first Raj H. Now, I think Nick Schaefer, Backyard TARDIS, I think he's actually thrown us some super chats in the past, but it was on a different channel. So we'll do one for Nick too, because he's been one of our most ardent supporters since the beginning. But Raj, I salute you, sir. Thank you so much. Very much appreciate that super sticker. Mr. Joker, hail Kadish, hail chat. Yes, hail. Good to see you, Joker. Glad that you came back for another live stream. It's very nice of you. Jimmy Vanderhorst, hey everyone. Hey Jimmy, appreciate you showing up. Raj, woohoo, yes, woohoo. Thank you so much for the very first super chat on the channel. Appreciate that. All right, guys, so let's talk about Star Trek. And we're going to be talking specifically about Star Trek Discovery in this podcast. So if you're worried about spoilers and stuff like that, I don't think we're going to get too deep into specifics of the season. So if you haven't seen it or you're worried about spoilers, don't worry about it. We're going to be talking more in broad terms about some of the problems that are ingrained into the whole concept of Star Trek Discovery from a writing conceptual standpoint. And then we're going to be talking about how to fix those, or what should have been done correctly in the beginning. So this is going to be kind of a wonky podcast or wonky live stream, whatever you want to call it, because we're going to get deep down into the nitty gritty of a show's DNA. And for all of you guys in chat, I want to not only thank you for being here, but I want to encourage you to participate, because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be going through and listing out all the issues with the show. And so I'm going to be relying on some of you guys to kind of maybe bring stuff up that I might miss, or make suggestions on things that I have overlooked in terms of how to fix things. So I'm really hoping that you guys in chat will participate with me in this little breakdown. But before we get into the Star Trek Discovery breakdown, I want to talk a little bit about the news that hit this week, which is that Paramount and Viacom, by extension, have renewed their deal with Alex Kurtzman and his production company, Secret Hideout, for the next 5 years, I think. Yeah, 5 years. So up to 2026. And basically they inked an overall deal with Kurtzman and his production company. And what an overall deal means is basically whether it be movies or TV shows or whatever media it might be, the studio gets a first look exclusive with the production company. And in exchange for that, they pay more money. So basically production companies, they can make stuff for like a bunch of different studios if they want to, but with an overall deal, it's specifically for one studio. And so like if that studio rejects the idea, they can't go and shop it to a different studio. So the studio is paying extra money for exclusivity for that specific talent that's at that studio. So for instance, Warner Brothers paid J.J. Abrams something like $500 million for their overall deal with him. That means that all of JJ's stuff has to go through Warner Brothers, and he can't shop it around to other studios. Same thing with David Benioff and Dan Weiss with Netflix, where they had something like a $300 million overall deal with Netflix, which I think was a terrible waste of money on Netflix's part. But they basically went to Netflix, and basically all their stuff has to go through Netflix. And if Netflix doesn't like it, they can't shop it around to other studios. So that's basically what this deal with Alex Kurtzman means, is he got what is estimated to be a $150 million overall deal. We don't really know the specifics of what that is, but that's what the rumor has been, is $150 million. And that also means that he's going to be heavily involved in Star Trek for the next 5 years. So if you didn't like his run so far, chances are you're really going to hate what's coming. We're going to talk about that right up at the beginning. David Walker says, I used to write as a teenager in high school. I had a major focusing problem. When I get a chance, can you give me any tips, please, for focusing? You know, I think a lot of writers actually struggle with staying focused on certain things. And I think that, you know, I can tell you what works for me, because you know, everyone has their own kind of style of writing and their own little creative process. So what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for every person. But I can tell you what I do to kind of help stay focused and stuff like that. But I would really encourage you to experiment and find stuff that works for you. Basically, anything that works in terms of writing or a creative process is anything that leads to a completed product. Okay. So if your goal is to write a book or a screenplay or to make a movie or a YouTube video or something like that, any process that's going to allow you to actually complete that is the process that you want to focus on. Anything that kind of makes you meander and never quite gets accomplished, that's something that you want to move away from. For me, what I like to do is I have stacks of these like note cards on my desk. And every morning when I wake up and I sit down here, I'll list out everything I want to accomplish throughout the day. And when it comes to writing, I'll say like, I'll try to keep it achievable for the day. So instead of saying like, write a novel or whatever the case may be, I'll say complete a scene or complete a chapter or something like that. So like if I'm working on, let's say, the next Rook and Berenger book, I'll write down on my thing, write one Rook and Berenger chapter. And so throughout the day, once I get inspired or find the time to sit down and write, I'll start working on that, and I'll just try to get one chapter done, and then I'll cross that thing off my list. And over time, that stuff compounds, and eventually you have a finished book. But you want to keep things kind of achievable, because if it's too grandiose, too general, it's going to be hard to kind of focus on getting that going. So for me, I like to keep things kind of small and achievable, stuff that I can do within the course of a day, within my busy schedule. When it comes to actually like sitting down and writing, what I've found is that, if you have a hard time focusing, one thing you want to probably focus on is outlining before you start writing, because if you have a good idea of what you need to write, the writing becomes easier, and it becomes easier to focus on getting it completed. So I'm a big proponent of outlining. I'm a big outliner. And that's something where it's just like you sit down with your notepad or with your computer screen or what have you, and you just kind of word vomit from your brain and type out, ideas. And eventually, once you get your ideas on paper, you can go back and kind of, focus on refining them until you get to a point where it's like, yes, this is what I want to write. And then once you have that, you can be like, okay, this is what I'm going to write today. And so that can help you get focused and help you achieve your goals and stuff like that. So overall, keep the writing goals easily achievable. Pre-plan what you're going to write by outlining or brainstorming or whatever you want to call it. And then focus on getting the writing done within an allotted time period. Now, sometimes, some writers have a hard time staying interested in writing. And what you can do is what's called sprints, which is basically you set a word count, like let's say 500 words, right? And throughout the day, you just do these sprints of 500 words where you sit down, you write, and once you hit 500 words, it's like, or at the point you get bored, you're like, I'm done. You walk away. And then later on throughout the day, you're like, oh, maybe I'll do another sprint. You do another 500 words, right? So like you can break up your writing depending on your interest level. So that's kind of what I would recommend if you have a hard time like staying focused. Just stay focused as long as you can. Do your sprint and move on to other stuff. And then when you're ready to write again, come back to it. The important part is just finding a process that works for you. Because like I said, everyone's different. What works for me might not necessarily work for you, and vice versa. There are a lot of people out there I know who will wake up and they'll sit in front of their computer and they'll just stream of consciousness write until they get tired enough to want to go to bed. And then they'll come back the next day and they'll keep writing until everything's done, and they won't even go back and edit. They'll just publish what their stream of consciousness wrote. And that's their process. I can't really criticize that. So if that works for them, that works for them. But you just need to find out what works. And once you find out what works, start refining it, start practicing it, and eventually you're going to achieve a lot. All right, so that was a major aside there. Sorry, but I hope, David, that helped you out. So let's get back to talking about Alex Kurtzman. And I'm going to show you guys this article. So this is an article that I wrote, published on RT, which is a international news site. It's Russian state media. It stands for Russian Time. So it is sponsored by the Russian government, but it's kind of like a worldwide version of CNN for Russia and Europe and stuff like that. So they do a lot of really good news coverage. If you're not into Russia or you have a problem with Russia or whatever, sorry about that, but these are the guys who are kind enough to publish my stuff. I haven't been able to find an American media outlet to do that quite yet, but hopefully sometime soon. But this is a new op-ed that I wrote all about the Alex Kurtzman thing. And if you guys want to read this, you can probably just type in my name, Matthew Kadish, and RT and Alex Kurtzman, and it'll probably pop up in Google or something like that. But basically, this is kind of a breakdown of Kurtzman's history and kind of how he's mismanaged Star Trek and the ire of the fans that Paramount made this decision. And this morning, there was someone who tweeted at me. I forget what, but they were, I forget who it was who tweeted at me, but they were someone who basically couldn't understand why Paramount would want to hire this guy. And he said, like, they must not like money because he's running the franchise into the ground, which means that a lot of people believe that Alex Kurtzman's actually costing Paramount money in his handling of the franchise. And this is the same fallacy that we see with Disney's Star Wars, where people believe that Kathleen Kennedy is running the franchise into the ground and that she's costing Disney money, and they are stupid not to fire her because, you know, they're not going to be as profitable with Star Wars going into the future. But they're not seeing the matrix. They're not seeing the bigger picture here. So here's the thing about Alex Kurtzman. Yes, he's a terrible writer. Yes, he's a creatively bankrupt person. Like, he just takes stuff that other more talented people made in the past and kind of rejiggers it, puts his own stamp on it, and pumps it out there. I'm not an Alex Kurtzman fan. I don't agree with any of the choices he's made for the Star Trek universe or anything like that. But I will say this about him. He is a very good producer. And what I mean by that is he's able to make TV series. Not saying that they're quality TV series. I'm saying that he's able to take something from a conceptual phase into a production phase, into a post-production phase, and into a distribution phase. So he's able to make multiple TV shows that get out there to the public. Okay, now why is that important? Well, what a lot of people don't understand is that the true money from Star Trek, at least for Viacom, Paramount, CBS, is from licensing. That has always been Star Trek's strength. When I worked at Paramount, they would call Star Trek the Golden Goose, because even for all those years where Star Trek was off the air, whether it be from the original series to the Next Generation or from Enterprise to the J.J. Abrams Star Trek was consistently earning CBS and Paramount money, okay, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. And that was all through licensing. And licensing is basically free money for Hollywood, right? You license out a product to t-shirt companies, to toy companies, to video game companies, whatever the company is, it doesn't matter. Glassware companies, you know, the ones who do coffee mugs, pillow companies, you know, who want Star Trek branded stuff on their pillow throws or what have you. There's an infinite number of businesses out there that you can license stuff to. And Star Trek, because it has such a strong hardcore community, is always a moneymaker for these licensees. So if you have a Star Trek thing on your product, Star Trek fans are most likely going to buy that product. And so it works out for Paramount, which is the licensor, and the licensee who's selling stuff with the Star Trek brand on it. And the thing about licenses is that Alex Kurtzman when he came on board, there had been no new Star Trek on TV since Enterprise, which I believe went off the air in 2005. So 2005 to 2017 is when I think Discovery premiered. What Kurtzman did is, so he wasn't really involved in the genesis of Star Trek Discovery. That was all Brian Fuller. And once Brian Fuller got the rug pulled out from under him and got fired, Alex Kurtzman kind of came in and kind of took over the show. And under his stewardship, we've gotten Star Trek Discovery, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Decks. We're getting Star Trek Prodigy, which is a kid show version of Star Trek for Nickelodeon. And we're also getting Strange New Worlds, the Starfleet Academy show, and potentially Section 31. So that's 7 shows that Alex Kurtzman has overseen just for Star Trek, okay? Now, with each new Star Trek show that comes out, Paramount gets a new license that it can sell off to licensees, right? So the Discovery license is different from the Picard license. The Picard license is different from the Lower Decks license, and so on and so forth. So every new show that's produced is more free money for Paramount in terms of licensing. So the reason that they rehired Alex Kurtzman doesn't have to do with the quality of what he's producing, it has to do with the quantity of what he's producing, because he's very good at getting shows up and running and getting them out there and getting them going so that Paramount can license the crap out of them, right? And that's why they're so high on Alex Kurtzman, is just because of his output. All right, so that's the big reason that that Paramount looks at Kurtzman as, you know, the future, and he's got a lot of stuff planned for Star Trek. And the more series that he can get off the ground up and running, the more money Paramount makes, not only in terms of like finance, you know, like TV commercials and movies and stuff like that, but the big money is in the licensing, because that's free money for the studio. And so that's something that I just kind of wanted to talk about with the Kurtzman overall deal, is that Paramount's looking at him to just get stuff out the door, whether it be for their streaming service or for their broadcast network or what have you. They just want new stuff that they can license out. And that's the inside baseball of that. Now, for those of you who want to learn more about kind of the inner workings of the studio system and how this stuff all comes together, how studio executives think about this stuff, and specifically how it's affected Star Trek, I would encourage you to go to my Medium account here. So this is, you know, my Medium account. I haven't really written a new article for it because I've been posting stuff on RT, but if you scroll down here, you'll find that I have like a 4-part series, which I entitled Star Trek Civil War. And this is all about kind of like the inside baseball, behind the scenes history of Star Trek and Paramount and all the shenanigans that have gone on with it. But it also explains licensing and the real money behind Star Trek and all that stuff. So if you go to medium.com/@Matthew Kadish, that'll take you to this page. Here's an example of the first part of the series that I wrote. I should probably do a follow-up, like a part 5, just to kind of cover what's been going on lately. But if you go to Google and you just type in my name and Star Trek, this will probably pop up if you want to find it and read it. If you're into that type of thing and you really want to know about like what's affected Star Trek, how the corporate culture at CBS and Paramount have affected Star Trek and stuff like that, I'd highly recommend you check it out. I think there's also audio versions of these, so if you just want to listen to them, I think it's just like a computer voice that reads the article to you or something like that. You can go check that out. But one of the things before we get into the actual writing of Discovery that I wanted to talk about is this Inverse article. So inverse.com, it talks about Star Trek's next 5 years. And again, this has to do with Kurtzman getting renewed. This is, let's see here. This is from Ryan Britt. It was published about 17 hours ago, so a pretty recent article. And it's a really bad article. Now, I don't mean it's poorly written. I mean that the perspective that this writer took in talking about this stuff is very shilly. And what I mean by shilly is that this guy seems to be making propaganda for Paramount based on their decision to rehire Kurtzman. It's very complimentary towards Kurtzman and all these bad decisions that Viacom is making in regards to the Star Trek franchise. But I would recommend you guys read it just to kind of get an idea of what Kurtzman has planned, because it doesn't look good. Like we know for a fact that Kurtzman's involvement is going to screw crap up because he's terrible. But I believe there was a line in here, let me see where I can find it, where it basically says that, first of all, it's comparing the Marvel MCU to what Kurtzman wants to do with Star Trek. Here it is. So following the announcement that Kurtzman's deal with Viacom CBS will extend for at least 5 more years into 2026, the New York Times writer Nicole Sperling noted that Kurtzman's vision for the Star Trek franchise is to get much weirder, quote unquote, compared to what we've seen so far. And if you know what we've seen so far, you know that it's pretty freaking weird, and not in a good way. And so he's planning to take things even further than what he currently has, which in my opinion is not a good thing. It's really not a good thing. But the the part where this article truly lost me, I'll get to in a second, but here he basically says, in comparing to the MCU, that Star Trek's a franchise where you don't have to watch everything that comes out in order to understand what's going on, right? He says with MCU, you're forced to watch everything in order to know what's happening, whereas with Star Trek, it can be a little bit more insular. And Kurtzman even said earlier this year, quote, "Our goal is not to make it so insular that if you haven't seen the show, you're lost when you watch another show." So they want you to be able to watch all the different Star Trek series without having to see all the different Star Trek series, right? And know what's going on. So like they're all kind of like their own self-contained insular thing where you don't have to have seen Picard in order to know what's happening in Discovery and vice versa and stuff like that. Which I think the original Next Generation era series did really well, right? Because you had something like, 4 Star Trek series going on at the same time at one point, or at least 3. Next Generation, DS9, and Voyager were all concurrent. I don't know if Enterprise premiered while Next Gen was still going, but yeah, so at least 3 concurrent series. And because they were all going on within the same time period, you did have crossovers, but you didn't need to have seen like the other shows in order to know what was happening in the show that you were watching, right? So I think there's a right way to do that, and I also think there's a wrong way to do that. And I think so far under Kurtzman's stewardship, they've been doing things the wrong way. But the biggest part here that lost me in the article is that Star Trek canon isn't that big of a deal. Like they actually wrote this sentence. And I want to read this to you real quick. So, although continuity is important to a certain group of fans, what the newer shows are proving is the elasticity of Trek's canon. Now, I want to point out certain group of fans. No, continuity is not important to a certain group of fans. It's important to fans. A show's continuity is the show. You can't just go back and get rid of things that came before it because it's convenient for you without pissing off actual fans. The people who don't care about continuity aren't true Star Trek fans. Because if they were true Star Trek fans, they would care about preserving the integrity of what came before it. Because that's part of the fandom. That's part of the story. That's part of Star Trek. If you don't care about Star Trek's continuity, you don't care about Star Trek. You're not really a Star Trek fan. If you're like, oh, they can kill off Kirk and have him after his affair with McCoy, or whatever they want to do, it's like, wait, what? No, you have to respect what came before, right? You have to respect the original series. You have to respect Next Generation. You have to respect the choices that were made leading up to the stuff that is coming out now. Because if you just disregard everything that came before you, you're basically disregarding the fan base, the stuff that fans grew up with, the stuff that fans love, the stuff that fans celebrate. And that's a huge FU to the fans. And I think that's been Star Trek's biggest problem under Kurtzman, is that he doesn't seem to care about the Star Trek fan base. He's falling into that selfish Hollywood mentality of this is the Rian Johnson thinking. This is my story. I'm going to tell my story, and if you don't like it, you can go F yourself, right? That's not the proper way to be a good storyteller. Okay, that's the proper way to be a selfish storyteller. That's the proper way to be a poor storyteller. Good storytellers always keep their audience in mind. And when it comes to the Star Trek fandom, I have yet to find a more dedicated, loving, and faithful fan base than Star Trek fans. I've been going to the Star Trek convention out here in Las Vegas for years. And every time I do, I am blown away by just the love of this material that the people who come to these conventions have. And that's what's been keeping Star Trek alive and thriving since it first went off the air, 50, 60 years ago. And I feel like there's a culture at Paramount that consistently takes these fans for granted. It's like, as long as we slap Star Trek on the title of whatever, they're going to eat it up. And to a certain extent, that's true. A lot of people who are hardcore Star Trek fans will eat up anything that has Star Trek in the title, whether they like it or not. All right. like a lot of Star Trek fans are complaining about Picard, about Discovery, and to their somewhat credit, the producers of these shows are trying, at least attempting, to make changes, make course corrections to bring it more in line with what fans want. But I think that the fundamental issue here is that they don't understand Star Trek fans, and so they don't know the proper course with which to correct to. And a lot of this just comes down to basic story. Like, you don't have to be a Star Trek wonk or a Star Trek aficionado or even a hardcore Star Trek fan to make a good Star Trek show. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in today's live stream. You just have to be a good fundamental storyteller. You have to understand story structure and characterization and, plotting and things like that. If you have a good grasp of that, you can make a great Star Trek show. But you can't make a good Star Trek show while ignoring canon or making it, as this article says, elastic. All right. Yeah, you can kind of futz around with canon a little bit, but the more you do that, the more you run the risk of pissing off the fan base, which is never a good thing for a franchise, because the fan base is the lifeblood of franchises. If you lose the fan base, the franchise falls apart. We're seeing that with Star Wars. We're seeing that with pretty much anything that Hollywood is trying to force into the wokeness that we see coming out of Hollywood. All right, real quick, just want to kind of go through chat here. Hey, Matt Vader. Matt Vader is in the chat. I'm glad that he was able to make it in. Kaylee D, hi. Thanks for showing up, Kaylee. You're one of our favorites. The Playdude 23 says howdy to Vader. Lunar Girl is in the chat. Backyard TARDIS. I did make a note of that, I think. I don't know exactly what he's talking about. Nick says, I'm dropping some truth bombs. Glad to hear it. Andy Magna. How many TV shows have you worked on? I haven't really worked on any TV shows. I've been in writers' rooms for like TV series that never got off the ground. I've crafted Bibles for proposed TV shows that I wanted to make. And for those of you who don't know, Bibles are basically kind of like a collection of what the show's going to be. So you talk about the characters, you talk about the format, you talk about story ideas and stuff like that. And it's basically something that you can hand to any writer who comes into the writer's room and say, this is the show. And so they can go through it, get up to speed on how the show is supposed to be written, and then go off and write an episode of it. So I haven't worked on anything that's been published, or I should say produced necessarily, but I am familiar with the process. Now, I get the feeling that Andy here is trying to prove a point by saying, like, well, you haven't done anything, so you can't criticize anything. And it's like, well, no. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think any intelligent person is free to criticize anything they want. It's part of free speech. And I just want to say this up front, that today's live stream is not meant to be mean-spirited towards Star Trek Discovery. I understand that there are people out there who enjoy the show. And I've watched all 3 seasons, and it's been getting better. Now, that's not saying much. Season 3 was a definite improvement over season 2. Season 2 was a definite improvement over season 1. But they're still, in my estimation, not very good shows. And so what we're going to be doing in today's live stream is we're going to be breaking down why they're not good, at least in my opinion, and what they could be doing to be better. And that's not to say that if you enjoy the show that you're wrong or you're stupid for liking the show. That's not it at all. You're entitled to like what you like, right? And if you like the direction that Kurtzman's taken Star Trek, if you like the shows, that's fine. I happen to really enjoy Star Trek Lower Decks. That's unpopular amongst some of the circles that I run in because a lot of people don't like Star Trek Lower Decks, but I personally happen to enjoy it because I think it's kind of funny and goofy. I'm not here to tell you don't like Star Trek Discovery. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong for liking Star Trek Discovery. I'm just here to have a conversation, kind of share some of my thoughts and some of my views on this stuff. So please keep that in mind as we're going forward. Andy, I hope you stick around with the stream and you participate in the chat because it's great to have, other differing opinions. 52 movies a year. So in other words, no continuity. I don't think they're saying no continuity. I think they're saying that continuity isn't a priority. which again is bad. But when you have so much continuity with Star Trek, it can get a little bit difficult to keep track of what came before. And this is one of the reasons why J.J. Abrams decided to just get rid of it for his movies, because, like, you know, he didn't want to have to deal with 50 plus years of Star Trek continuity when he was making his shows or his movies. And that's the lazy way to go about doing it. Good writers would respect what came before, and they would have like a staff of people who are just Star Trek researchers or encyclopedic Star Trek knowledge to sit there and proofread stuff and be like, hey, you know, this is wrong, or like in this episode, this happened, so you can't do that in this episode, or what have you. I know that when I was at Paramount, Brandon Braga, who was running Enterprise, which was going on there at the time I was working, he hated having actual Star Trek fans be part of the writer's room, because they would do stuff like this. They would say, well, this isn't right with continuity. And he's like, I just want to tell the story I want to tell. Stop hitting me over the head with continuity. So this is a running thing, especially the longer a franchise has been around, the harder it is to kind of keep track of continuity. And so this concept in this article is that continuity is elastic, which means that you can kind of ignore it to a certain extent, blah, blah, blah. But I fundamentally disagree with that. Let's see here. Nick says, yeah, while you didn't have to watch DS9 to watch Voyager, they kept the same canon. Very true. And that's what made those things good. 52 movies a year. I think writing the Bible for a show would be funnier and more creative than the script episode writing, but I'm not a writer. It depends. A TV show's Bible is a little bit more conceptual, and it varies in terms of detail. So, for instance, J. Michael Straczynski, who wrote Babylon 5, he had a Bible, and it was extremely detailed. Went through all 5 seasons of his planned show, and of course, like, he made adjustments to it as, you know, the show went along. But everything he needed for Babylon 5 was in that Bible, and I think he had like note cards that he could like switch out and rearrange and stuff like that when it came to that Bible. So his Bible was very detailed, but something for like kind of a more episodic show, like for instance, just off the top of my head, Castle, you know, with Nathan Fillion. The Bible for that would be something like, you know, like a best-selling writer teams up with a New York City cop. They have sexual tension as they go about solving mysteries, and then they like list out all the characters. They probably have the show's formula in there somewhere where it's like, here's what we want in an opening stinger. Here's what we want in the first act. Here's what we want in the second act, blah, 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 all the way to the end. And so that's much more general, you know, and then in the writer's room, they'll have what they call breakout sessions. Well, they'll sit down and they're like, okay, we have 21 episodes we have to fill. What are some ideas for episodes? And they'll come out with 21 episode ideas that they really like. And then they'll assign those to writers. And then the writers take those episodes ideas and flesh them out, and they run them past the showrunner, and the showrunner will make changes as he sees fit. And then the script gets locked and goes into production and stuff like that. So the actual script writing can be a lot more creative, but you have to work within the formula that the Bible kind of lays out. And depending on who's running the show, the series Bible will probably be, you know, varying degrees of specific. Philpy says, do they publish show Bibles? That would be well worth getting. I don't believe they do, but Michael J. Straczynski wrote a great book. I think it's called Writing for Television or something like that. Just go on Amazon, search for his name. In that book, he kind of explains the process of writing a Bible. It's where I learned about it for the first time, so I would heavily recommend that. If you're interested in TV show Bibles, check out that book. Vader says, I remember seeing a TNG Bible somewhere. It might have been at a con. Check eBay. eBay's a good one. I don't know if they publish Bibles because it's really just for the writer's room. So if there is a Bible out there that's published, it's probably been kind of worked up for publication. Might just be like a behind the scenes encyclopedia or something like that. The actual show Bibles, they're not super, you know, detailed or in depth or very interesting. You know, it's just something. It's a tool to help writers write for the show. Is essentially what they are. Let's see here, Lunar Girl. Sorry, I can't stay. Need to get groceries or no coffee tomorrow. Have a great day, guys. Lunar, thank you so much for showing up. We really appreciate you coming into these chats. It's fantastic. Jamie Vanderhorst sounds like he Ryan Johnsoned it. Mark, Ryan, that's not how things work. Ryan, let me make my movie. Yeah, Ryan Johnson, you know, he's a very kind of selfish filmmaker. And what I mean by that is that he makes the types of movies he wants to see, and he makes the types of stories that he wants to partake in or experience. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is something where if you put him in charge of a franchise with a fan base, it doesn't jive well, because when you have a fan base that you need to cater to, you need to make stories for them, not for yourself. And that was the big problem with The Last Jedi, is that Ryan Johnson was making a Star Wars movie for him, and he didn't care about anyone else. And that was a problem. And I feel like Kurtzman is kind of doing the same thing with Discovery, where he's making stuff that he wants to see, not Discovery, but just his Star Trek stuff in general. He's making stuff that he knows CBS is going to make money off of, as opposed to making good stuff. So there's that. Okay, guys. So we went over the Kurtzman stuff. I now want to get to the meat of this episode, which is Star Trek Discovery, what's wrong with it, and what could be done to fix it, right? So in order to do this, I am going to go to our tried and true notepad. I'm going to Devin Nash this thing. And I've already blown it up, so hopefully you guys can see this stuff. Just need to kind of get some stuff organized here. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so how to fix Star Trek Discovery. Now, this assumes that there's something wrong with Star Trek Discovery to begin with. And I think most of Star Trek fans can agree that Star Trek Discovery, not too good. There are a lot of problems with it. And there's been problems with it since it premiered. Now, if you like Star Trek Discovery, by all means, continue liking it. This isn't meant to be an attack on Discovery or the people who like Discovery. This is just kind of meant to be a discussion, like a thought exercise, so to speak. So we're looking at this from not only a film critic, TV critic perspective of, you know, this is media we consume and we're going to break it down and analyze it. We're also looking at this from a storytelling perspective. Now, I could say a writer's perspective, but film and TV is much more than just writing. It's storytelling. And storytelling encompasses stuff like art direction, acting, all the elements that go into making one of these things. So writing is a big part of that, but storytelling just kind of encompasses everything. So we're coming at it from the mental frame of storytellers, okay? So the first thing that I want to do is I want to figure out what are the problems with Discovery. Okay, and these are things that are essentially kind of ingrained into the DNA of the show that work against it. Okay, these are things that turn audiences off. These are things that prevent the show from achieving like legendary status, what have you. So I want to ask the people in chat if you have an idea of what some of the problems with this show are, beyond like it sucks or whatever. Please put it in the chat. Let me know. I'll be reading the chat as I go about doing this. And if I see something that's interesting, I'll pop it in here. But we're not looking for necessarily subjective critiques like I don't like Sonequa Martin Green or something that, like, you know, isn't kind of ingrained within the DNA of the show. We're talking about fundamental problems, things like story structure, episode structure, things that can objectively be critiqued. So let's see here. We have Matt Vader 74. His first thing is forced pandering to current social issues. Okay, so what we'll do here is we'll put the problem as including propaganda, because that's what current social issues are, right? You're pushing a particular political point of view, and you're kind of including propaganda into the storytelling of your show. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, a lot of kind of Star Trek defenders will say, like, Star Trek's always been woke, though, they've always dealt with social issues. And yeah, like a lot of science fiction is used as an allegory for modern social issues. The problem is the way they go about doing it, right? So like if you look at a show like The Orville, which came out around the same time as Discovery, they also deal with a lot of kind of current social issues, but they do so in an intelligent way. And I think it's because a lot of the writers for The Orville also wrote for the original Star Trek, like Voyager, for instance. And so they know how to do this stuff correctly, which is basically, you give kind of both sides of the issue and you leave it unresolved after highlighting what the pros and cons are. And you let the audience kind of decide which area they fall on to, as opposed to preaching a specific message. Okay. So Vader, that was a very good one. Let's see here. Changing previously established characters. That's actually a very good one. Okay, so changing previously established characters. James Rogenbuck, very good thing there. So what are some of the characters that were previously established that they changed? Well, Pike, Spock, number one. These were all characters from the original series that they kind of brought in, jiggered around a little bit. So we have a lot of that stuff there. Vader again says pronoun lectures, LOL. This kind of goes in with the propaganda that he talked about later, but this was especially prevalent in season 3, where they introduced a main character who is non-binary. And it was interesting because they actually took time out of the episode to talk about their pronouns, where it's like, we're going to refer to this character as they, them, right? Because they're not one gender or another. They're inclusive or non-binary. And in the scenes where you have main characters talking about this character and referring to them as they, them, it sounded so awkward and almost like they were like reading a script that had bad grammar in it, that didn't get, put in front of an editor before it went into production. And that's one of the problems with, this kind of like woke pronoun usage, is that if you read it, it comes off as somewhat comprehensible, but when you hear it spoken out loud, it becomes confusing. And so like, I just feel like it was not handled very well in the show, and it was just not used very, very appropriately. Let's see here. Nick says, I would add to Vader's thing that they are not handling their messaging in a Star Trek way. Yeah, I think we talked about that with when we mentioned that the Orville is being written by the people from Voyager. Let's see here. Joker says, tokenizing characters, gender, or race swapping. I don't think that they've done too much of that. Like, they haven't really race swapped any established characters or gender swapped any established characters. They have put into more prominence, female characters, people of color, stuff like that. But I wouldn't call that necessarily tokenizing. I feel like that's a creative choice that's well within the realm of what a showrunner can do. I know that when Brian Fuller initially pitched this series, his whole thing was, I want a black female main character. That's my thing. That's what I want to do. And Michael Burnham was the outgrowth of that. And so, like, I don't feel like if a showrunner wants to include this stuff, as long as it makes sense within the context of the story and the world in which the story is being told in, they can put in anyone they want, like non-binary, trans, whatever. The question is whether or not those choices are in service to the story and whether or not the end story is any good. Because if they're just doing this for agenda purposes as opposed to making it an actual story feature, that's where you start running into trouble, because that's when it becomes propaganda. And that's when it becomes preachy, and that's when you start turning off the fan base. And then Vader says, the humor they include doesn't seem funny. It's like they're trying too hard. I think that's kind of a subjective argument. Humor is always kind of based off of the eye of the beholder, I guess you could say, just like beauty. Some things that certain people find funny, other people might not. I know that one of the big criticisms of The Last Jedi was how Rian Johnson used kind of like more modern humor in the movie than came before it. George Lucas was notoriously bad at writing humorous stuff, which is why I think a lot of the earlier Star Wars didn't have a lot of humor in it. A lot of the more humorous moments in the original trilogy came from the actors kind of playing with their character, like Han Solo. A lot of the stuff between him and Leia, I think that's a testament to Harrison Ford more so than the writer. Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the humor of Discovery is bad. The first season is very lacking in humor. And as the seasons have gone on, they've kind of like done a little bit of a better job with the humor, but you still have stuff like that's the power of science people and stuff like that. That's awful and stupid. But again, that's a subjective criticism, and that's not something that I would consider like a inherent problem with the show. Okay, 52 movies a year says no well-rounded characters. A good character exemplifies human attributes, bravery, humility, and courage. Discovery characters have characters that if they show bravery, they cannot show humility, etc. I don't know if I agree with that as well. I do agree that the characters overall in Discovery haven't been very well-rounded. But you do have some characters who get a lot of attention, who become established, and you don't need every character to be brave or humble or courageous or anything like that. It depends on the character you're writing for. To me, a good, well-rounded character is a character that is true to the intention of the character, right? So like if you have a character who is supposed to be brave, but he continuously acts in stupid, cowardly ways, that's incorrect. But if you have a character who's meant to be brave, you can give him a little bit of hubris, because you kind of need that self-confidence in order to do brave things sometimes, because brave things tend to be stupid for the most part. They tend to go against self-preservation. So I would agree with you that well-rounded characters are necessary for a good TV show, but I don't agree that one of the problems with Discovery is that there are no well-rounded characters, because I think Michael Burnham's pretty well-rounded. Saru is very well-rounded. They're doing a lot with Tilly to kind of show her. So they do have some well-rounded characters, but I also think that that a lot of the character flaws that someone like 52 movies a year would consider to be bad character traits just stem from poor writing. Wouldn't 100% agree with that one. On DS9, Sisko refers to Dax as old man, even though the character is played by Terry Farrell, later played by another female. Yeah, so, Star Trek has had kind of like experiments with the gender of characters in the past. I know like at one point Riker hooked up with a character that had no gender. That was like kind of an interesting relationship there. The Trills, which I believe Dax was a part of, have long... like the slug that is the Trill itself has no gender, but the body in which they inhabit will have a gender, and they'll have different experiences depending on the type of body they're in. In fact, in season 3 of Discovery, they went to what was left of the Trill homeworld to try to figure out what was going on with this non-binary character that they had kind of picked up. So they're still using that trope right there. Jamie Vanderhorst says, humor can be good at face value, but poorly timed. See The Last Jedi. Not all jokes were bad, but most of them were just out of place in the story. That's very true. This happens, especially with Rian Johnson, where like he wasn't conscious of kind of like what came before him. He was just kind of focusing on his own thing. So a lot of what we see in The Last Jedi is inconsistent with stuff that we saw before. However, J.J. Abrams' style of humor, which is all throughout the first movie, The Force Awakens, is a little bit more consistent with what Rian Johnson was doing. So it wasn't completely like out of the realm of believability, but it was a very much more modern style humor than what we'd gotten in the previous 6 movies in Star Wars. Let's see here. That's very well covered in the series from Start Joker, kind of running gag, but I think you know this, and refers to the Trill and Dax. The Bridge Crew is basically a collection of set pieces with dialogue, glorified props. That dinner scene in season 3 was such an obvious attempt to create dysfunction within the crew. Sounds about right. You're absolutely correct. One of the biggest problems with Discovery has been how they've treated the ensemble, and we're actually going to talk about that right now. So chat, very good job at kind of highlighting some of the issues with Star Trek Discovery. So the big thing is the inclusion of modern propaganda into the DNA of the show, and changing previously established characters. That's obviously a big thing. But let's get into some of the more nitty-gritty here. So the biggest problem with Discovery, in my opinion, is that the central character isn't the captain. Okay, so this is important. Why is this important? This is important because did I spell captain wrong? I think I did. I'm a professional author, everyone. I can't spell. Thank God for spell check. So in every previous incarnation of Star Trek, the central character, I'm not going to call him the main character because in these TV ensembles, there are several main characters depending on, what episode you're watching. But the central character, the one that kind of like drives the main story of the series forward, is the one who basically makes the decisions, and that's the captain, right? In the original series, the central character was Kirk. Yes, you had Spock and McCoy and, all that, but Kirk was always the one in charge of the 5-year mission. He was the shot caller. If Spock or McCoy disagreed with Kirk and they went against his orders or what have you, that's one thing, but he was the one who overall throughout the course of the series was driving the action. Same thing is true of Next Generation. Picard was the central character. Now, you had lots of shows that focused on other characters within the ensemble, but at the end of the day, Picard was the one in charge. And if you look at the overarching 7-season storyline, Picard was the one who was defending humanity, which was constantly on trial from Q. So from the first episode to the last episode, Q was basically judging humanity, and that was kind of like the overarching story, even though there were all these other smaller stories within the overarching story. And Picard was the one who was in charge of that. And, being the captain, he was the shot caller and things of that nature. So overall, general series, he was the captain. Same thing with Sisko. He was the commander of DS9. He eventually becomes a god, And then with Voyager, it was Janeway. Janeway's, her goal was to get her crew back home. That was the overarching meta episode or meta story of Voyager. And with Enterprise, you had Captain Archer, and he was at the forefront of the temporal Cold War and all that stuff. And so up to Discovery, the central character of the show had always been the captain or the commander, like whoever was in charge. And that's important because the central character is the one who drives the action of the overall series forward, right? And the initial problem with Discovery is that you have Michael Burnham, who is not the captain. For the first 3 seasons of this show, she was the first officer. And that was kind of like an interesting take. I know that was Brian Fuller's decision where he was like, I want to focus on, a different character than a captain, because like every single show before us had a captain. But that was also a fundamental mistake in the show's DNA, in my opinion, because it led to so many situations where Michael Burnham was constantly undermining the person who was supposed to be in charge, whether that be Giorgio, whether that be Lorca or Pike, or eventually Saru. None of the captains were able to actually kind of like showcase their ability to command because Michael Burnham was constantly undermining them. You'd have these ridiculous scenes where Michael Burnham would say, like, this is what we need to do. And the captain would be like, yeah, okay. Especially under Pike. Pike seemed really neutered under Michael Burnham. And the problem with that is that, when you have underlings constantly undermining those who are their superiors, at least in terms of rank, you get situations where it starts to stretch believability. And a big thing with writing a believable science fiction story, or any story for that matter, is the suspension of disbelief. You want the audience to just kind of go along with what you're doing and not question things. So you want to have like a narrative lube, I guess you could call it, which is basically like you want people to be able to suspend their disbelief and just enjoy the story that's being presented to them, as opposed to them being taken out of the story and to begin questioning this stuff. And the issue with not making Michael Burnham a captain of the Discovery from the beginning is that she's constantly put in these situations where she's undermining her commanding officer, or she's making her commanding officer look like fools. And this makes her come off as a bit of a Mary Sue, but it also really undercuts the character of the people in charge. And that reflects poorly on Michael Burnham, because even though she might be right within the context of the story, it makes her look like a jerk. Because, a lot of the captains in the show, like Giorgio, not so much Lorca because he was a bad guy, but like Pike and Saru, these were like really great characters. These were characters that the audience wanted to like. And when we saw Michael Burnham constantly undermine them, we were like, Michael Burnham's a real jerk. Like we don't like her because she's doing this. And so like that was an inherent problem with not making her the captain, right? So that is one of the first fundamental problems in this show. So one of the second ones is this show is not a focus on the ensemble. So all the best Star Trek is about the crew of the ship or the vessel that is the focus of the show, whether that be the space station, Deep Space Nine, or Voyager, or Enterprise, or what have you. It's the crew that really carries the show, right? So that when you have more than one main focal character, that's called an ensemble. I believe that's French. So one of the things that Michael Piller did when he became the showrunner of The Next Generation about 3 seasons in was he took a shift in focus from Roddenberry's initial, hey, this is going to be a problem of the week that the crew has to solve, where he was like, from now on going forward, each episode is going to focus on one of the members of the crew, and that's going to be our formula. And so you get episodes about Data, you get episodes about Geordi, get episodes about Riker, about Troy, about Crusher, about Wesley, about Worf. The whole ensemble would get their own kind of like little episodes in which to shine. And through that, the audience got to know each individual character on the bridge crew and come to like them. Like Worf had his fans, Riker had his fans, Picard had his fans, Data had his fans. Like there was always a character that one part of the fan base or the audience would gravitate towards, and they'd really enjoy that character, and they'd like to see them in more episodes, and so on and so forth. The issue with Discovery is that it was all based around Michael Burnham. And so if you didn't really like Michael Burnham, you tended not to like Discovery, right? Because the character, if she just wasn't your cup of tea for whatever reason, the show became a chore to watch. It became boring. And it was basically, the mentality for these streaming shows is that you can break out of the episodic model for a lot of network TV and make what is essentially one long movie. And so Discovery, at least the first season, was treated as one long Star Trek film. That was kind of like the concept behind doing what they did. Same thing with like all the Netflix shows, and basically all the streaming original series for the most part are treated like one movie, where they have a story where if you watch it from episode 1 to the final episode, it tells one single story. And if you hop into the middle of those episodes, you're probably not going to know what's going on if you didn't see the stuff that came before it. So in that sense, they were treating it like this is Michael Burnham's story, and we're going to focus on Michael Burnham, and we'll have a few side characters like you had Tilly and Saru and Giorgio, and in the first season, Lorca. But for the most part, every other crew member on Discovery was completely glossed over, right? And so, in fact, it was such a problem that at the beginning of season 2, when Pike took over, they set aside a scene just to introduce you to the actual members of the crew, of Discovery's crew, because they never bothered to do that in the first season. Like, you didn't know any of these characters. You didn't know their names. You didn't know what they did, any of this stuff. And so in the second season, they were like, oh, you know what? Maybe we should start incorporating the crew a little bit more. And so that's what they did. It was a very funny scene because it was like we've been with these people for God knows how many episodes by now, and we're just now learning their names. So the fact that that Discovery was not an ensemble, I think, is a terrible problem, because the strength of Trek is the diversity of the cast, and having lots of different interesting characters that, like, let's say you don't like one character, there's another character over here that you really do enjoy. Like, for instance, with Deep Space Nine, which is one of my favorite Star Trek series. I really hate Kira, whatever her name is, the Bajoran first officer. I just find her grating. I never liked her character, but I love Miles O'Brien. And so every time Miles O'Brien's on screen, I'm just like, hey, Miles O'Brien, yeah. So on the Miles O'Brien episodes, I really enjoy them. On the Kira-centric episodes, I'm just kind of like, yeah, I don't care. So, but just not liking one character is not going to make you hate an entire show, unless that show is geared around that specific character constantly. And I think that was a big problem with the DNA of Star Trek Discovery, which is that it was not based around a ensemble. Okay. Also, in addition to that, the crew members that we did get to know were unlikable. Think back to the first season of Discovery, just for a minute, if you will. And this could also apply to the first season of Picard as well. So aside from the central character, which would be Michael Burnham or Picard or what have you, we do get to meet other members of the crew. So in the first season of Discovery, we get to meet Lorca. We get to meet Stamets, Saru, Tilly, all this stuff. Initially, all these characters were very unlikable. I don't think Lorca ever got to be likable, but again, he was supposed to be the bad guy, so we can give that a pass. But he was a very kind of like shifty character. You never trusted it. You were supposed to not like him. But a character like Stamets, for instance, the head engineer, he started off as a complete prick, and he didn't get much better. I did not care for his character at all the entire first season. Now, as the show went along, they kind of lightened him up a little bit, and they made him more likable. And by the time you get to season 3, I actually think Stamets is probably one of the more interesting characters in the show. But the flip side of that's Tilly. Tilly was always meant to be the likable, bubbly, kind of like sidekick character to Michael's, adventures. She just came off as annoying and stupid and completely unlikable, like completely the opposite of what they wanted her to be, because they were trying too hard with her. I still don't like Tilly. I know that they put her on this command path where, like, by season 3, she was getting to flex her Sulu muscles in terms of commanding the ship and potentially being a future captain and stuff like that. But by that point, like, I still didn't like her all that much. So, like, I wasn't invested in her big ascension into, like, command. She seems like a real throwaway character to me, and every time we get a focus on Tilly, I'm just like, I check out because I don't like her. So, like, there are a lot of characters where when we do finally get to see their story, we just don't care because they're not likable enough. And part of making a good ensemble show is highlighting characters like 52 Movies said, making them well-rounded, right? We didn't get any of that in the first season of Discovery. It was either Michael Burnham is perfect and everyone else around her is a jerk, or pretty much everyone's a jerk. Those are your two options. So that is a big problem with Discovery. All right, so the next fundamental problem with Discovery is that it was a prequel. And this goes back to what we were talking about, that was it Inverse article? where basically prequels screw with established continuity. Okay, this is a problem for the fan base, right? Like when you go back and you start telling stories within an established time frame that conflict with stuff that came before it, you start to create confusion in the fan base, you start to create resentment, and you start to create a division between the people who don't care about continuity and the people who do. And that creates fan infighting, and that's not healthy for the long-term fan base. So the issue here, and I blame George Lucas for this, because before he came along with the Star Wars prequels, going backwards and doing prequels wasn't really a thing. Yeah, it happened occasionally, but it wasn't like a go-to strategy, you know. And Hollywood, being as lazy as it is, because Hollywood just on default is lazy, prefers to do prequels because there's already a wealth of kind of ideas to draw from that makes their job easier, as opposed to coming up with new stuff, which is infinitely harder. So the fact that they went back to the original series timeline for Star Trek Discovery was a bad idea to begin with. And the reason it was a bad idea is because, you know, number one, it creates all types of problems with messing with established continuity, which we already covered. But it also kind of constrains the writing crew in what they're allowed to do and what ideas they're allowed to play with. You always want to be moving forward in your narrative, never backwards. What's been done in the past has been done. You can build on top of that as a foundational thing. But when you go back and you try to add to that foundation, you eventually end up forming cracks in it, which weakens the entire structure. So the proper thing to do when making new series for TV shows or sequels to movies or whatever is to go forward as opposed to going backwards. Prequels are not a good idea. They're never a good idea. In fact, I don't like the Star Wars prequels at all. I don't think that they were stories that needed to be told. I think a lot of that stuff could have been communicated by going forward. Like, imagine if instead of making the prequels that Lucas did, he took the time to tell a sequel to the original trilogy using Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford. Imagine the type of stories we could have gotten with the original cast and you know, new developments, as opposed to having be constrained. And another issue with this is the technology, right? When you go back in time, the technology that was available in the 60s to make a science fiction show does not match up with the technology that's available in the 2020s or late 2010s. So when you have a situation that's supposed to happen in the original series timeline, and yet the technology has like holograms, it's like so far advanced than what came before, you create a disconnect between the connection to the original trilogy and the new stuff. And that also offends the fan base, right? So you don't have that problem when you're moving forward. Like if this stuff were to happen 100 years, if Discovery were to take place 100 years after The Next Generation, for instance, you could have all this crazy cool technology and it would just be a progression of what came before it, right? And there wouldn't be that disconnect there. But because they're setting this in the original time frame, it messes with the fan base because they're like, this doesn't look like what I remember it looking like in that time period. And there's that argument where it's like, yeah, well, I mean, like, you know, you don't want the sets to look like they're cardboard in a modern day TV show. It's like, well, then don't set it in that time period. You know, set it in a future time period where you can have these fancy sets without it messing with what came before it, right? So being a prequel was the big thing here. And the biggest thing with being a prequel is that it doesn't progress the universe. And what I mean by that is that it stagnates the franchise because you're locked into what you can do within continuity, but it also you can't introduce anything new or radical or surprising. You can't shake things up. especially when it comes to Star Wars, if you set your Star Wars series within the original series time frame, that has reverberations to Next Generation, DS9, Voyager, all that stuff. So like you can't have a brand new bad guy come in and ravage the Federation, because then you're like, well, why didn't they mention this in the Next Generation? Like, why was this never talked about before if it was such a huge, impactful thing? And that's one of the big problems with the first 2 seasons of Discovery, is that you have these major events happen that were never referenced before. And so it creates a disconnect with the audience, especially the longtime fans who have seen everything and know the continuity backwards and forwards. So this stagnation that comes along with crafting a prequel prevents the show from growing and expanding and coming up with new and exciting stuff that expands on the lore and gets fans excited. Like if they had tried to do the Dominion War during, like right after First Contact, would it have had the same impact as seeing it play out in DS9? I don't think so. So this was another huge mistake that was made with Discovery. Kind of going along with this, and with the first one of the central character isn't the main captain, they made Spock's sister. And I remember this was a huge, huge deal when it was revealed. And it still is a huge deal in my opinion. This was a major mistake that they should have never done. First of all, making Burnham human but having her act Vulcan. If you want to make a character boring, just have them act like a Vulcan. Spock was interesting because he was constantly contrasted with Bones and Kirk, right? He was like the straight man that you have in a comedy troupe, where you have like the goofy guy, then you have the straight man that he plays against, right? That was Spock's role. But the straight man is never a good main character because they're just boring. They're cardboard. They're good when they have someone who's goofy or manic to play off of, but as a standalone main character, they're not good, which is why Vulcans never make a very good main character in these shows. Now, books a little bit different because you can get inside their head and find out what makes them tick, but on TV shows and movies, Vulcans tend to be very dry and boring, and they're only as good as the characters they have to play off of. So the fact that they made Burnham a human but had her act like a Vulcan, very strange decision. They either should have just made her a Vulcan and have her act like a Vulcan, or just have her be human and have her struggle with having been raised in Vulcan society, where she was constantly kind of ostracized or penalized for her emotions and stuff like that. So I think that decision in and of itself was a bad one, but making her Spock's sister was very bad because it goes back to the prequel stuff, messing with established continuity. Why did Spock never mention a sister? Now, they kind of came up with a retcon for this at the end of season 2 of Discovery, but it was a very dumb retcon. It was something that didn't need to be in there. And I think that the reason that they decided to make her Spock's sister, and this is just a theory of mine, I have nothing to back this up, is that they were afraid that if they didn't do something to connect her to a beloved and established figure within the fan base, audiences were going to reject her character because they're, number one, it's a woman, number two, she's black, and number three, she's a Vulcan, I guess. I don't know. But the big thing is that I think that they were taking such a risk by making a black woman the main character of the show. And I say risk in the sense that a studio executive would look at the show and be like, I don't know if our demographic is going to accept a black woman as the main character of a show. So I'm not saying that black women can't be the main character of a Star Trek series. I'm saying that from studio executives' perspective, this was a risky move. And so a way to get around that risk and to try to trick the audience into instantly accepting a black woman as the main character of a Star Trek show is to link her to a beloved character. And they couldn't link her to Kirk, they couldn't link her to McCoy, so they chose to link her to Spock, because Spock is and always will be one of the most popular Star Trek characters ever invented. So I believe that making her Spock's sister was a deliberate attempt to try to ease the audience into liking her and accepting her, when they were like taking a risk at making a black woman the main character of a Star Trek show. I feel like the correct decision would have been to just let her stand on her own as her own character. Yes, it was probably risky to make a black woman the central character of a Star Trek show because audiences, general audiences aren't used to that. But if you look at the Star Trek audience, we had a black commander with Cisco. He's one of my favorite characters in my favorite Star Trek series. We already had a female commander in Voyager with Janeway. Just combine those two, you have Michael Burnham. I mean, I think that isn't even an issue with the Star Trek fan base. It's like, oh yeah, you want to make a black captain who's a woman? Yeah, I'm on board. Let's see how good she is, right? So I feel like if they had disconnected her from the whole Spock thing and just had her stand on her own as her own unique character who had to sink or swim based off of her own merits, I think that would have been a much stronger choice, and audiences probably would have been far more on board, because the entire time you're watching her, you're just thinking like, this is Spock's sister? What's going on here? And it's always in the back of your mind when you see Michael Burnham on screen. You're just like, I can't believe that's Spock's sister. So I believe that this was a very, very bad initial decision. Another problem is that the series concept wasn't sustainable or unique. So when it comes to TV series, you have to have what's called a sustainable concept, which is a concept that can carry the series throughout multiple seasons for multiple episodes without burning itself out or running into roadblocks or things of that nature. So for the original Star Trek, the concept was wagon train to the stars, which is basically, exploration. The crew would be out in space and they would, be exploring, and they would run into different problems that they would need to figure out solutions to. And that was the concept of the show. It was very broad, it was very open, and it worked really good. And it worked so good that they carried that over to the Next Generation, where the Next Generation had a mission to explore, strange new worlds and new lives and new civilizations. So Next Generation was the exact same concept as the original series. Now, when it came to DS9, they shook the concept up a little bit, where instead of, this exploration concept, it was a more political concept. It was something where it's set on a static location, the space station, and you got to see how different alien races interacted. And a lot of the drama from DS9 came from dealing with all the various alien races from the Star Trek universe. And it was a very interesting take on things, allowed them to tell more adult, more mature kind of stories. And then you also had the exploration aspect with the wormhole that went to, I think it was the Delta Quadrant. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But all that stuff made it a unique concept that was also sustainable. And then Voyager's concept was very simple, where basically their concept was they're really far away from home and they have to get back home. And on the way home, they run into all types of new and exciting things. Enterprise, I think, had a bad concept in the sense of the temporal Cold War. Whenever Star Trek messes with time, I don't think it's a very good idea. So I never got too into Enterprise. So I can't really speak intelligently about it, but I don't think that maybe their concept, while unique, wasn't truly sustainable. I don't know. I just always had an issue with the Enterprise show. So that brings us to Discovery. Now, chat, I want to ask you guys, can you tell me what Discovery's core series concept was? Can you tell me what their sustainable / unique concept was? Bueller? Anyone? All right, so the issue is that it's hard to pin down, right? So the core thing about Discovery is their spore drive, this new drive that's able to transport them instantly throughout space through the mycelial network. And this is something that was so convoluted and crazy and stupid and weird that a lot of people still don't understand it. To the point where I'm thinking that they might actually start to phase it out in seasons going forward, although like that would kind of be difficult because that's Discovery's one unique feature. So like they have this spore drive that can take them anywhere in the universe instantly. And what do they do with it? They don't really do anything with it, right? And it's not sustainable. It's like once you jump to another point, like, okay, what else is new? So the series concept for Discovery was inherently flawed in the sense that, okay, it might have been unique, this network of mushroom spores that you can kind of travel along to get to anywhere instantly, but it certainly wasn't sustainable. It wasn't something that kind of broke new ground in the Star Trek universe. Now, it could have been. We're actually going to talk about that in a little bit, but it wasn't. And the final thing I would say is a problem with Discovery is that it included nudity and curse words in a traditionally family-friendly show. Now, I understand that when you're making a show for streaming where you don't have to adhere to the FCC guidelines on decency, that it opens you up to doing stuff like showing boobs and using the F-bomb and curse words and stuff like that. The problem with this comes in with what came before, right? Which is that Star Trek has always been a family show. What I mean by that is it's something that families could watch and enjoy together. And yes, that was an outgrowth of it being on broadcast TV, and you're not allowed to swear or show boobies and stuff like that. But, Star Trek did do sexy stuff in its run. It had affairs, it had romances, it had all this stuff. But it never fell back on using foul language, and it never showed you more than, young eyes could handle, right? And when Discovery came along, they were like, the gloves are off. We're going to go crazy. We're going to show Klingon titties, and we're going to, curse like drunken sailors. And it was a bad decision because families who grew up on the previous series who wanted to watch this one now couldn't. It had to be something that the parents watched before the kids to make sure it was okay for the kids to watch. And with some of the graphic violence in Discovery and even Picard, it's like you can't show your kids that stuff. Even if you're not like prudish and don't care about language and nudity and stuff like that, some of that violence, that's stuff that would give kids nightmares. So the fact that they made it so graphic in terms of nudity, curse words, and violence, and made it not family friendly, hurts the fan base because I know so many people who watch Star Trek with their kids, and that's how kids learn to love Star Trek, right? That's how. I used to watch The Next Generation with my family growing up, and that was something that we all enjoyed doing together, and that was something that fostered my love of Star Trek. And you can't do that with Discovery, at least not with the first 2 seasons. So it was a very bad decision to make it so dark and mature and inconsistent with what came before it. Now, there are ways to do mature storytelling without nudity and curse words and graphic violence. It's a lot harder to do, which is why Hollywood doesn't do it too often because, again, Hollywood is inherently lazy. But it's important enough for the Star Trek fan base to have a family show in the sense that people of all ages can watch and enjoy it, that this should not have been incorporated. This should not have been a decision made for the Star Trek Discovery. It should have been something that, yeah, you can deal with mature themes, kind of like how DS9 did that stuff, but you can do it without showing graphic violence. You can do it without showing nudity. You can do it without curse words, So just do the extra work and you won't have this problem. Okay, so these are all the problems that I have with the fundamental DNA of Discovery. I hope you guys all agree with me that these are issues. Even if you don't, these are some of the things that I believe need to be addressed in order to fix the show. Okay, so let's talk about fixes now, right? So let's talk about the show's central concept. A good show central concept is that it's something that can sustain it through numerous episodes and numerous seasons. So at least 7 seasons. You always want to aim for 7 seasons. If not 7, then at least 5. So it's gotta be valid for at least 5 seasons. And it's got to be valid for at least 21 episodes per season, because that's the traditional TV. Now, with the advent of streaming, you can kind of shorten that a little bit to maybe 10 episodes or 12 episodes. But ideally, you want to have it be for as many episodes as possible, because the more episodes of a TV show you can produce, the more money you make. So you want it to be totally sustainable. So one of the central issues of Discovery is the spore drive, right? Now, it doesn't have to have been a spore drive. It could have been just like a new form of, of space drive, is what we'll call it, which is something that can instantly transport you anywhere. Okay, so let's say that we'll go along with Brian Fuller's initial spore drive thing. I don't even know if that was his idea or if that was something that was brought into the show afterwards. But let's just go with the spore drive for the sake of not changing too much from the initial show. The spore drive is something that can basically take the Starship Discovery and put it anywhere. Now, what if the central concept of this show is that the spore drive is unreliable, and instead of teleporting you from one point in space to another, it teleports you unintentionally from one dimension to another. Okay, now this would have been very interesting, because essentially you have a Voyager type show, which has the Voyager kind of like overarching plot structure to it, where they're trying to get home, but instead of being really far out in the Delta Quadrant or wherever Voyager was, I didn't really watch Voyager all that much, they're in a situation where they're hopping into alternate realities. And that's initially what I thought Discovery was going to be, because they're discovering basically new realities. And that opens up tons of storytelling possibilities. So you could have even set this in the original series time period, just like they did. And when they test out the spore drive for the first time, Discovery, instead of showing up at a different point in space in their reality, is now in the mirror universe. Or they're in a different universe with even crazier stuff happening. And so every time they use the spore drive to jump, they run the risk of going into an alternate reality that gets them further away from their own reality and presents them with new challenges and new dangers. And so they're discovering all these different versions of a Star Trek multiverse. I think that would have been an amazing central concept for Discovery, is that this new space drive that they've invented, whether it be the spore drive or something else, in the testing of it. So the crew of the Discovery is kind of like a science crew mainly that's meant to be like test pilots for this new thing. Something goes wrong, and all of a sudden they're in alternate realities, and every new reality they face presents different challenges. And that's something that, whether they jump into a new reality once per season or they do it multiple times per season or whatever, that's something that's sustainable, because every new reality they jump to could be something completely different and completely new and completely interesting, and would also help kind of bridge a lot of the continuity gaps. So like we could say that the Discovery crew started off in an alternate universe from the central main Trek universe, and they jump into the J.J. Abrams universe where the Kelvin timeline happened, and that would have established, oh, that's a separate universe from the core Star Trek universe that we know and love. And so they could have done all that stuff. Yes, Keg Crusher, they did do that with the series Sliders, where they were moving into alternate realities, but they already kind of established that in Star Trek with the mirror universe. There are other universes out there, multiverses, that kind of mirror ours, but are different in certain ways. And so I think if they had used that concept as Discovery's core concept, where they were traveling through different dimensions, different universes, that would have been something that was not only sustainable, but also unique and interesting, and would have brought a new perspective to the Star Trek universe. So I really would have thought that would have been where they were going with it, but unfortunately that is not the case. All right, so let's talk about the character, Michael Burnham. All right, so for the purposes of this thought exercise, we're going to assume that Michael Burnham stays the same. She is a Black woman who is the central character of the show. But I would say the first thing is to make her human, right? Don't try to make her into a Vulcan. Vulcans are boring. If you wanted to make her part Vulcan, make her a minor character or a supporting character. Don't make her the central character. But for our purposes, we're making her a central character. So if you wanted to make her interesting, you have to make her human and make her struggle with her Vulcan upbringing or something like that. I know that that's what they tried to do, but I don't think they did a very good job. So I would just rather have seen her be like a rebellious human who grew up in a very restrictive society. And now that she's in Starfleet, she has a hard time following orders or like what have you, simply because she's naturally rebellious. And that's what drew her to Starfleet in the first place. Also, make her the captain. If not right away, then very soon. I think that they could have done something interesting where, like, let's say she's part of the Discovery test flight crew because, you know, she's been shuffled off to these dangerous assignments due to the fact that she's not very good at following orders, and so she can't find a permanent place on a more stable ship. She comes on board and butts heads with Captain Giorgio immediately. But Captain Giorgio wants to try to, like, you know, nurture her and tame her because she sees something in her. And in their initial kind of flagship test flight of this new space drive that Discovery's testing out, something goes wrong. The ship is damaged. It's thrust into a different universe. Captain Giorgio is killed or injured or taken out of the equation somehow. And Michael Burnham, being the first officer, is now in charge of the ship. And this is a first officer that the crew is not familiar with. She doesn't have a good reputation. She's impulsive, all this other stuff. And so the crew doesn't trust her. And so now she's captain of the ship. She's the shot caller. She's the one making the decisions. And she not only has to exhibit proper leadership and make the right calls, but she also has to win over her crew and make them trust her. And I think that's a very interesting kind of situation for a captain to be in, where you have a crew that basically doesn't trust you and is actively working against you or subverting you at every step. And you have to not only deal with them, but also deal with the exterior challenges that are being faced or presented to you. So make her captain, put her at odds with the crew. Like, you could have even had a situation where Lorca was like a Section 31 guy who was assigned to the test crew, and he doesn't trust her, so he's constantly undermining her, and he could be like her main antagonist within the crew, and he's the one who's kind of marshaling distrust against her because he wants to command the ship. And so you have an internal power struggle in addition to all that other stuff. I think that would have been interesting. Also, no link to Spock. Make her stand on her own 2 feet, make her own unique character, make her interesting outside of previously established characters. I think that's very vital to having a good central character, is that they're able to stand on their own 2 feet. Okay. Next thing I would do to fix this is to make the show family friendly, but mature. So in making shows for a streaming service, like, you kind of have to push the envelope a little bit, but you can do so in a family friendly way, which basically means, like, don't have the characters swear. If you want them to swear, come up with new words, like for Battlestar Galactica, instead of the F-bomb, they use frack. You know, they're in the fracking walls, you know, like that type of thing. That's fine. You could do stuff like that. As long as kids are able to watch and enjoy the show without their parents worried that, you know, they're going to pick up some bad things from it, you can get away with it. No nudity. Star Trek doesn't need to have nudity in it. You can have sexy time. You can have romances, but, you know, draw the line at nudity. You don't need to see Klingon titties in an episode. And what I mean by mature is that you can tell adult-themed stories and stories that are darker in nature without resorting to graphic violence, nudity, and curse words, right? That's the sign of a skilled writer, is to be able to do mature adult stories without falling back on lazy storytelling, which is what all those things are: graphic violence, nudity, and curse words. Whenever I see a book or a TV show or something like that with excessive swearing or just nudity for no good reason or just very gross graphic violence, I'm always like, okay, this is being written by someone who is a very inexperienced or immature storyteller. If you look at Game of Thrones, for instance, Dan and Dave Benioff, or David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, are terrible, horrible, inexperienced, immature storytellers. And they're taking a story from a very mature, very skilled, very talented writer, George R.R. Martin, and they're adding stuff to it that wasn't in the original necessarily. But they're bringing to the forefront stuff that is very stupid. Like a lot of the sex and nudity that was in the Game of Thrones show wasn't necessarily in the books. Yes, the books did have some of that stuff, but they brought it to the forefront in the show because it was like, oh, titties and bad language, graphic violence and stuff like that. That was all the showrunners of the show. And as they veered further away from the source material, you saw how bad of writers that they actually were. And those three things, graphic violence, excessive vulgarity, and nudity, are all crutches for poor storytellers because they're shocking and they're titillating and they're easy to do, and they don't require a whole lot of thought. And so a lot of immature storytellers rely on that stuff. So make the show family friendly, but keep some of the more mature themes, but do it intelligently. So I think that would be a good way to fix some of the issues with Discovery. Next is to bring crew members into bigger positions of the series and stories. So we want Star Trek to be a true ensemble show. And they've kind of been doing this a little bit more as Discovery's gone on. I know that the third season was probably the most ensemble the show's ever been. But we want to get to know the whole crew, or at least the bridge crew of the Discovery, because it's the crew that carries the ship and carries the show. So we want to see more people kind of not only come into more prominence in terms of like the stories that are being told, but we also want to see them made more interesting, because I think that there were a lot of characters that they tried to kind of bring out to the forefront and didn't work. Like, for instance, Lieutenant Kayla Detmer, who's the pilot of the Discovery. She's like the woman who got her face messed up in the pilot episode, and she's got like some enhancement parts and stuff like that. She was experiencing PTSD in the third episode, or third season, I should say. It was really weird. Like, they tried to bring her to the forefront and flesh her out, make her more interesting, and it was a little bit too little too late. Like, she's just not a very interesting character. We don't know much about her. I don't think the actress who plays her is very good. Very sorry, Emily Coates. You're just not to my liking. Another character that I think they didn't do enough with, not seeing them on here. It might be in the further season. But, for instance, Lieutenant Joanne Owosukin. I'm sorry, I'm bad at pronouncing names, but she was the co-pilot / navigator. She's basically in Chekhov's seat in the Discovery. Like, she's a character who's featured very prominently in the show, and like, we don't know anything about her. There was a character who was almost completely robotic in the first two seasons. I think it might have been this Lieutenant Nilsson. Yeah, I think this was her. So she played a different character who was like completely augmented. She was basically a robot. She was in like a horrible accident, and almost every part of her body was robotic. And they killed her off in the second season, and brought in the same actress to play like a whole new character to play her position. It was really weird. But that character, like when that character got killed off, we were supposed to feel very emotional about it, but we didn't know enough about her character to really care when she did die. So what we want to do in a correct TV show is to take the ensemble and bring them to the forefront, give each character their own episode to the point where we know who the character is, we're invested in the character, and we're interested across multiple characters. Now, in a streaming show where you don't have 21 seasons, where maybe you have 10 episodes, you have to deal with a main character. So Michael Burnham, what you can do is you can pull the Holy Trinity trick, which is what they did in the original Star Trek, which is you had a core group of 3 characters. You had Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And then you had satellite characters that kind of rotated around this Holy Trinity. And so what you want to do is, if you can't do a true ensemble, you want to have at least 3 core characters, or 2 characters around Michael Burnham that you can base the show around. And you have to make sure that these characters play really well off of each other. And that becomes your ensemble. So instead of doing like the entire bridge crew, you focus on all 3. So that is my recommendation for that. Is we want to get to know the crew. If we can't get to know the crew, then at least give us more than one main character to latch onto. Then we want to talk about do not make it a prequel. Set it in the future of the franchise. You don't want to stagnate your franchise. You always want to keep it moving forward. One of the cool things about the Next Generation as compared to the original series is we got to see an advancement in technology. We got to see different uniforms. We got to see how things have progressed since Kirk and Spock were gallivanting around the galaxy. And when you go back in time and you start futzing with canon and continuity and stuff like that, you piss people off. So just don't do that. Go forward in time. If you're going to make a time leap, do like 100-year leap from the Next Generation time period and show us new technology and new discoveries and things like that. You don't have to be tethered and constrained within the continuity that's before you. Yes, you have to be true to the continuity that came in the past, but the future is wide open. So you're free to tell a bunch of new and exciting stories that you're not able to do when you're in a prequel situation. And I think that the showrunners of Discovery knew this. They heard the fan backlash about it being set in the original time period. And so at the end of the second season, a little bit of a spoiler here, they go 1,000 years into the future. And now they're completely free to tell new and exciting stories, but they're also free to screw up that canon between the original series and 1,000 years later. So it would have been nicer if it was a smaller time jump, and you could have kind of eased into certain things. But I think that from the beginning, you always want to continue the forward momentum of a franchise. So set stuff in the future, set stuff after what came before, set stuff after what came before it, and move forward with the franchise and make new developments and new discoveries and new big changes to the universe and stuff like that. Don't go backward. That's lazy and it creates problems. So I would not have made this a prequel. I probably would have set Discovery initially at least 100 years after the events of the Next Generation. All right. And finally, I would say make the show more episodic. Have an overarching story arc. And this is kind of like traditional TV stuff where you would have an episodic TV series over 21 episodes, but sprinkled through in there were mythology episodes that kind of advanced a larger story arc. You saw this a lot with Buffy where in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, each season would have a new big bad, and the overarching story arc would be to fight that big bad. But within that seasonal story arc, you had these episodic episodes where she'd go off and fight other bad guys and deal with other stuff. And then occasionally the big bad would show up and she'd have to deal with him. And so like you got that overarching story progression, but at the same time, you got kind of more episodic stuff. And I think that they tried to do that more in season 2 of Discovery when Pike came on board, and it felt a little bit more episodic. And then in season 3, it also kind of felt a little bit more episodic. But sorry. I'm the destroyer of words. But I think that that's an important thing where basically you're able to watch these episodes without having to have seen stuff that came before it. I know that they're trying to do like the whole 10-hour movie type thing when they're doing these series that you can sit down and binge. Even though most of these streaming services are releasing their original series week to week because they want to stretch stuff out. So I truly believe that if you're telling a 10-hour movie and you're releasing it week to week, you're doing your audience a disservice because that stuff's meant to be watched all at once, just like a movie is. If you set stuff up episodic and you release it week to week, it becomes a little bit more palatable. It becomes something where it's like, oh yeah, I watched that and I can see where they're going with it and stuff like that. So I think that just Star Trek in its DNA initially is episodic to begin with. And so I would like to see Discovery have been a little bit more episodic with these mythology episodes sprinkled in that kind of advance an overall story arc. So they could have, going with our initial central concept idea of them jumping from reality to reality, different universes, stuff like that. As they're trying to find a way home, they could be running into an impending threat to all the different universes that they're, jumping to, including their original universe, their home, that nobody knows about. And Discovery just happened upon it because they just happened to have this accident that, led them to these different universes. So it could be like some type of weird, alien race or entity that is able to cross realities and consume these universes and leave just nothing but destruction in their wake. And Discovery is the only one who knows about it. And it's heading towards their reality. And so they have to kind of, figure out ways to deal with this and stop it or slow it down or something like that. So there's a lot of things that they could have done with that concept had they been, inclined to do so. But making a show more episodic gives you more leeway to kind of focus on the ensemble characters, kind of develop more themes and more interesting ideas, make a bottle episodes. You could bring on writers to write very unique standalone episodes that could fit into the series, just like the original Star Trek shows. And then, have the showrunner kind of focus on the main mythology episodes that progress the overall season arc. So it's a good balance of interesting science fiction there. So those are the things I think that could have been done to fix the issues with Discovery. Now we've gotten 3 seasons of what we've gotten. I'm not part of the Discovery show, so I don't have any input on this stuff. From the very beginning, Discovery was flawed. It had fundamental problems with its DNA. In fact, we went over all of them. The show DNA had all these different problems in it. And these are things that when you sit down and plot out a show, like we talked about doing series Bibles earlier, this is the type of stuff that you want to consider. This is the type of stuff you want to think out before you actually go into production. I know that the production of Discovery was so chaotic, and Brian Fuller was getting pushback from Les Moonves and a lot of cooks in the kitchen and all this other stuff. And I think that the Discovery we got was very far from his initial kind of concept of what he wanted the show to be. And then by the time the show went into production and he got fired and Alex Kurtzman had to come in, the fundamental issues were so ingrained that it took a lot of work just to course correct as much as we have by the end of season 3. I know that Kurtzman isn't actively involved in the day-to-day. I think that he kind of stepped in on season 2 and then set it on the course and then handed it over to Michelle Paradise, who did a decent job with season 3. I think that the cast for Discovery is really good. And so I'm interested to see the characters. I loved Oded Fair as the Grand Admiral of the Federation. I'd love to see more of his character. I'm kind of sad that we got to see Saru sideline because I really liked his character too. But going forward, they made Michael Burnham the captain finally, so that obviously fixed one of the major issues with Discovery. And they're no longer a prequel; they're in the future, so that fixes that. And they're going off to, the whole thing about her being Spock's sister, that was resolved in season 2. So slowly they've been fixing these issues. I just don't think they're doing a very good job at fixing them. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more thought and care go into the show initially. Anyway, guys, I have rambled long enough talking about this stuff. I'm sure I bored the heck out of some of you guys getting all wonky and discussing writing stuff and storytelling stuff. So real quick, I just want to see if anyone has any comments they want to leave us on. I know that Keg Crusher is in the chat. That's Matt Vader's brother. Thanks for coming by. We got the Plato 23 in here. 52 movies a year. I think Vader left the chat. First Space Lord is in the chat. Burnham was a human raised on Vulcan. Yeah, we talked about that. Nick is in the chat. Backyard TARDIS. So, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. If nobody's got anything to say, I'm just going to close out the show. So, real quick, we're still experimenting with our live stream setup. We want to do more live streams on a regular basis. I don't know if this writing stuff is of any interest to you guys because it kind of goes hand in hand with storytelling and the stuff that I'm passionate about, but I don't know how many people are passionate about it besides me. So be sure to let me know in the comments what you thought of this episode, if you agreed with me, if you would have liked me to talk about other stuff. The Salty Nerd podcast is really about movies and TV shows. And even though we're salty nerds who love to kind of pick apart stuff that we hate or dislike about movies and TV shows, we also like to highlight the stuff that we do enjoy and things of that nature. So the salty part is the critical part. The nerd part is the celebratory part. And, we try to strike a balance with that. But if you guys have any feedback for us, please pop it in the comments. Give us a thumbs up on this video. And if you watch any of our videos, be sure to always give us a thumbs up because it helps signal to YouTube that people like our stuff, and it'll help them put us out in front of more people. And hopefully we'll be able to build our audience and achieve the goal of getting Matt Vader 74 and Alex to quit their jobs and do this full time, because that's the end goal of this, where we're doing the podcast as a business and making a living off of it. And that would just be ideal. And we can't do that without the help and support of our viewers like you. So thank you so much for supporting us. Also, if you want to financially support us, go to saltynerdclub.com. There, that will take you to our Patreon page. We're trying to hit 100 patrons by the end of the year. The patrons that we do have are fantastic. They're very loyal followers, loyal listeners, loyal participants. We love and cherish each and every one of them. And we would love to add to that little club of ours. So like if you're so inclined, please be sure to check that out. If not, go to saltynerdstore.com, buy some of our merch. I've got our Basement Dweller t-shirts up on there. Shout out to James Mangold for that one and all that good stuff. Anyway, guys, real quick, this Friday, I'm also doing another podcast or I should say live stream, where I'm getting established writers to come on the live stream and talk about what it takes to destroy a franchise. So we're going to be breaking down all the mistakes that Hollywood's making and destroying beloved franchise. And it's not just going to be me, it's going to be other professional authors, people who've actually gotten stuff published, who understand writing and who are good at critiquing stuff, to come on board. And I'm going to be chit-chatting with them. So be sure to tune in Friday at 5 p.m. Pacific time. I believe that is 6, 7, 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And we'd love to see you there in the chat. And so that was our live stream for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this thing. Again, hit me up on Twitter at Matthew Kadish, Kadish, or in the comments below, or like whatever. And let me know what you thought of this. Let me know what you think we should be doing for a live stream. Ideally, I'd like to be doing live streams regularly 3 times a week. But it just depends on the schedule and whether or not you guys are enjoying this content. So just let me know about that. Anyway, everyone, thank you so much and have a good day. This is Matthew Cadish saying, stay salty, my friends.